Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Genji Challa wash processed Ethiopia from Sweet Bloom Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Sweet Bloom, based out of Lakewood, Colorado. And they're the coffee roaster that's appeared the most on this channel. However, this is arguably our most important Sweet Bloom review to date, as it marks our first full bag review of one of their coffees since they made the transition from the San Franciscan, the roaster they've been using since they first opened, to the Loring, the roaster that they switched to just a couple of months ago. When I first found out Sweet Bloom was going to be making this transition, it's something that definitely caught my attention. As somebody that's a huge fan of Sweet Bloom and their coffees and grew up drinking all of their coffees, I was curious to see how it might impact the overall results and experience. This right here is day 27 of this coffee. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit, and I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Sweet Bloom traditionally is a light medium American for the roast profile, and this one was as well. However, it just felt a slight shade lighter than I had previously experienced from their coffees. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 5, first impression, and it was a lot more positive of a first impression than initially expected. So let me put this into context, because I didn't know that they had actually made the transition yet. I figured that it was going to be something that they did in the future. So when I first tried this coffee, I assumed that they were still using the San Franciscan. So this was kind of not necessarily expected, because my previous experiences with Sweet Bloom's coffees have been that they don't leave the best first impression, especially when brewed so early, like a day 5 mark. This one, however, had a very vibrant peachiness to it, and as a result, it left such a solid first impression that I thought, we might be onto something special. This might be one of the best Sweet Bloom Ethiopian coffees I've ever had, and typically their Ethiopians aren't necessarily my favorite, but this one right here left such a positive first impression that I thought we might have something special on our hands. Day 7, ran it through the V60, and it wasn't quite as peach forward, but there was still plenty of it in the cup. It was skewing a little bit more in the citric direction at this point, but the entire cup felt a little bit more even and rounded. Felt so much of this coffee, the best of it anyway, was yet to come, so we continue on to day 9 as we ran it back through the Chemex, and once again was experiencing the much more peachy side of this coffee, especially pertaining to Sweet Bloom coffees, arguably the peachiest Sweet Bloom coffee I had ever experienced, especially on that day 5 mark. There again on day 9, there was plenty of florality in the cup as well, as it really seemed to shine in this brew method. So once again, I'm thinking we have something really special on our hands. Day 11, ran it through the V60, and the coffee felt borderline day and night between the two brew methods, as it didn't have that same sort of peachiness in this brew method, as it was much more on the citric side of things. So I felt, okay, problem solved here. I just like this coffee a lot better through the Chemex than through the V60, so we will just persist with that going forward, as in this brew method, so much of the floral citric aspects and the brightness are dominant in this cup, with significantly less of the fruit vibrancy. Day 13, ran it back through the Chemex, and it was lacking the same sort of stone fruit quality that I had previously experienced. So the best day I had out of this coffee was day 5, and day 9 was still good, but it wasn't quite the same experience as day 5. Here we are on day 13 with no big adjustments other than a little bit of time, and the coffee just felt slightly more tamed and subdued, especially relative to the typical experiences I'd had from Sweet Bloom's coffees. So at this point I felt something was slightly off, and it's at this moment I kind of reached out and tried to figure out whether or not they had made the transition in terms of the roaster, because typically Sweet Bloom goes the other way. Typically the first couple of experiences aren't necessarily the best, but then from that point it really increases overall. This one went the other direction, and that was kind of strange to me, and I noticed that at this moment, and I started asking a lot of other people whether they had noticed some changes from their Sweet Bloom coffees, when I found out that it was at this moment they had made the transition just a couple of months ago, and it was really noticeable, at least for me anyway, somebody with so much familiarity, but it was noticeable to a lot of other people that were also drinking Sweet Bloom's coffees pretty regularly. We're going to continue though. As day 15, the issues getting the cup right continued to persist as the temperatures were lowered. So I had tried a lot of things. I lowered the temperatures to maybe dial back a little bit of the citric acidity to this cup. I adjusted the grind size, and at this moment I just couldn't get this coffee right, as there was much more florality within the cup. It felt slightly darker in terms of the florality in that sense. It does open up as it cools, but at this moment I could not attain that same sort of peachy component that I'd experienced in this coffee initially. Day 17, the cup really started to have this kind of muddled clarity, especially relative to previous experiences with Sweet Bloom's coffees too. The entirety has this slight stone fruit at the cooler temperatures, but it really does accentuate the robust citric aspects to this coffee. So I was seeing the peachiness dial down, and I was seeing the citric aspects really ramp up, and I think from the early impression I was thinking this has potential for a stone fruit level 5 mark. However, by the end I'm like, this is going to be maybe a little lucky to maintain that level 3 mark. Day 19. The cup continues to demonstrate the sparkling citric acidity, especially as it does cool down. There is this slight peachy middle ground, but the majority of the cup really skews strong in the sharp citric direction. So I'm just having issues with this coffee, and it's kind of in line with my experiences with Loring's, as it reminded me a lot of my experiences with Say. Sometimes I will have a Say coffee and the first impression will be really impressive. From that point going forward, though, I can't seem to replicate that first cup of coffee no matter what I do, especially when I go back to the same sort of everything. Brew method, temperature, grind size, and I just can't replicate it. So that was a little frustrating, but let us go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And a couple of level 4s, let's go through those real quick. The finish at level 4, yes, it's a very citric finish to the cup. It's a very citric acidic finish within the cup of coffee itself, and those are the other two things at that level 4 mark. It's higher on the acidity than I typically experience from Sweet Bloom coffees, and it's pretty high on that citric component. So that right there is by far the most pronounced characteristic for me, and it definitely warrants that level 4, and it does kind of impact the rest of the tasting wheel, especially in the finish and in the acidity. So I think that that's justified there, and as a result, the saltiness, which has that lemon in it, that's ramped up all the way to that level 3, as well as the bitterness. So just how strong of the citric component in this cup of coffee was, it really impacted the rest of this tasting wheel. Stone fruit level 3, and I said in the review of the coffee itself that it would have been lucky to still maintain that level 3 mark, because I have a lot of difficulty picking out peachiness from this coffee. On this day too, here on day 27, it's not anywhere near as peachy as that first impression, so it's there, it's slight. I think it's on the lower side of the level 3 at this mark, which is a little frustrating because on the earlier days, it's on the higher side of the level 4 mark, so just a little bit of time has really kind of subdued the peachiness within this coffee. Sweetness level 3, that's probably the biggest sticking point for me, as this is not exactly the type of sweetness that I typically experience from Sweet Bloom's coffees, and I feel like I can say this given just how much familiarity I have with their coffee, because they always had this very defined, unique sweetness with so many of their coffees that I think was unique and special to the roaster that they had used, and the one that they had used for such a long time. And I oftentimes felt like that is what helped me pick out Sweet Bloom coffees from a lot of other coffees and made them really unique and special for me anyway. It wasn't there in this coffee. And that really impacted the cleanliness because I couldn't get a very defined profile from this coffee, which as a result, it leaves it at that level 3 mark, which is also kind of unique for a Sweet Bloom coffee. So I think the biggest things we're looking at here in terms of the adjustments from what I would typically experience from something like this is a lower sweetness, a higher acidity, slightly less cleanliness, and skewing a little bit more in the citric direction with a less defined citric profile than the other fruit components that I was really expecting from this coffee. So I agree with this tasting wheel on this day. I don't think too much has changed. The tasting wheel will look so different from the first time I tried it up to this point, but I think I really noticed just such a stark and unique difference to my previous Sweet Bloom experiences with this coffee. And it's easy to say that it was just one coffee. However, I noticed the same thing with that Guadalupe Herrera that we reviewed. I noticed it with another coffee that we're reviewing as well. And anything that I did try while I was out in Denver that was a Sweet Bloom coffee, I noticed that it didn't have that same sort of defined sweetness that I typically experienced. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I'm not gonna lie, it was really a little disheartening, I would say, to see such a drastic shift from my love for Sweet Bloom's coffees to something that I honestly couldn't tell that this was a Sweet Bloom coffee. It's good. I'm going to say it's good. This is a coffee that if a lot of other coffee roasters served me this, I would say that this is a really nice coffee, but it's not the same sort of unique, special, world-class coffees that I had had from Sweet Bloom for so many years, as it just lacks that very specific defined sweetness that I typically get from their coffees. And I'm getting a little passionate about this one, but it's because it just was really disheartening to find out that the reason for it isn't maybe a one-off. It's because they made such a huge transition into something that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the Loring. I really loved Sweet Bloom for what they were, and this one right here just wasn't quite what I was looking for. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you like the Loring, I don't want to kind of lump all of the Loring coffees in together, but this one reminded me a little bit more of a Say coffee than any of Sweet Bloom's previous coffees have, in the sense that it was skewing more on the acidic citric side of things. So if you like your slightly more citric acidic coffees in general, this one's probably a better fit for you. It had much more of that lemon curd than it did of the peachiness, and there are times where maybe with some adjustments you might be able to get a little bit more of the peachiness from it, but it really just kind of skewed a little bit more in that citric direction. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. We have another one of these Sweet Bloom coffees to review coming up, and I think I have some thoughts on that one as well that will pretty much relate to this experience. But I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of this coffee as well if you had an opportunity to try it. If you've tried anything from Sweet Bloom since they made the transition, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions, as I've heard from so many people kind of the same thing, that they've seen a really stark difference in the changes to their coffees since they made the adjustments. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Genji Challa wash processed Ethiopia from Sweet Bloom Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.